Tervetuloa kaikki kuuntelijat. Welcome all listeners to Futucast or Futucast. I still don't know how to pronounce our name in English, but hey, I think either works. Yes, this is another English language episode to all our Finnish listeners, Finnish language listeners. I hope you can hang along, and to all or to any eventual international listeners who might be catching this episode because of Dylan Burns's name, welcome to Futucast. We usually do podcasts in our wonderful Finno-Ugric language Finnish, which many of you might not understand. We have some English episodes there, so you might want to check them out, but mainly we do podcasts in Finnish. But we also do episodes in English whenever we get exciting guests like Dylan Burns on our podcast. And I guess, Dylan, we have to do this in English because you're Finnish, I'm guessing not fluent.
Absolutely not fluent. You know, I think I've seen a few Winter War movies, but I don't remember any phrase that they yelled or anything. I remember nothing. So I would be terrible at speaking any Finnish. But this is the first Finnish show I've ever been on. So you've got that medal. You have my first Finnish show, and I'm happy to finally break into the Finnish market.
We're proud and honored to have you. I think our listeners are going to love you. Do you know any words in Finnish? Do you remember anything from those movies?
No, nothing. I remember nothing at all. No.
But you've seen some of those movies, so your historical knowledge of Finland isn't zero.
Yeah. Most of my knowledge from Finland probably comes from that time period because that time period interested me quite a lot. The amount of I guess after coming to Ukraine, the story of the international volunteers to Finland was something that I got a lot more interest in because of the amount of international volunteers have been involved in Ukraine. It was also very similar in Spain, where they had a lot of international volunteers and English language speakers. And that story came back to the United States much in the same way that the story of Ukraine is coming back to the United States through a lot of its international volunteers and people who have come over to try to help out in whatever way they can, come back to the States, talk about what's happening there, and also international volunteers. And this was reported in Finland after the fact. Most historians seem to think this is the case, that the main help they did for Finland was bring the international attention to them. They didn't actually do much fighting. In Ukraine's case, they are doing more fighting, but they also, in the main way I would say all international volunteers help is by bringing more attention to the conflict from their home countries. Definitely when it's Americans or a lot of these countries that are Ukraine's main allies.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that. This has been I think we have most of our sort of international public commentators are mainly known for their Ukraine commentary at this time also. So, and there is definitely historical connection there. I don't know how much. Obviously, most Finns haven't lived through that time or that historical period that you were talking about, the Second World War. But still, I guess as a Finn, you understand quite profoundly how history can affect the modern day, even like modern day people. And I think that connection still lives quite strongly here. And that's one of the reasons that we support Ukraine, or most of us support Ukraine so fervently.
When it comes to Finland's connection to this war specifically, I think the most obvious direct connection, and this is for a Finnish audience, so I don't feel like I'm bringing any new ground here, but it was the pushing towards NATO membership for Finland, that Russia kind of put them in a position where they felt a lot more endangered because the threat of Russian aggression and the idea that the territorial borders in Europe are permanent, that idea is somewhat being smashed by the Russians, or the Russians are attempting to smash that idea. That kind of put the fear in God on a lot of people. And I also think that the Finnish, this isn't new ground, them having a relationship with NATO. They've had a relationship with NATO, and a productive relationship, a defensive relationship with many NATO states for quite a while now. So it's really a lot of formalization, a lot of the processes that were already in place. But the hard lines of things like Article 5 and membership is a seismic shift in the culture, the defense culture in Europe, and how people feel about the offensive alliance structures. Because you can see the polling data and the radical changes, and not only Finland, but in most NATO states and prospective NATO states.
Yes, absolutely. At this point, I might helps for a lot of our listeners to actually introduce you a little bit. So you're a political commentator, analyst, aspiring journalist. I think at this point you might be able to drop that aspiring.
I think so.
Yeah, because you're a bona fide journalist at this point, and Twitch streamer. and your videos can also be found on YouTube. I'm mainly on YouTube, so that's how I know you. Dylan Burns TV and Dylan Burns Live. And I don't think you should sell your perspective short as a non-Finn, because we sometimes might tend to get a bit boxed in our media sphere, which is why it's really valuable to get like sort of outside perspectives. And if we talk about the NATO membership for a while, I mean, I agree that the shift was quite massive here, actually. Like, we had been doing cooperation for years already. It's just that the membership hadn't been formalized. And the big thing, Article 5, that wasn't sort of an active option for us before membership. And despite the tight cooperation with NATO, the popularity of membership was actually quite not low, but it was in the minority. And that shift to being a mega majority was a huge shift in the Finnish political history. But how has that looked from your eyes? Like, how do you see the Finnish and potentially the Swedish NATO membership affecting the sort of the entire European defense scene?
What's interesting is it's not only Finland and Sweden, even though they're the ones that I think get talked about the most. A lot of people, I think, assumed that the majority of Ukrainians supported NATO membership before this war, because the Ukrainian government has at least talked about NATO-ship, or at least has kept that in a purview as something that they would maybe want to pursue, and that has been an active discussion ongoing for quite a while now, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the majority of Ukrainians, even up till 2022, did not support NATO membership. Now, it was more like close to 50-50, maybe 45-55. It depended on which pollster you talk to, but it was not a clear majority. Now it's a vast, overwhelming majority. We're talking 70 to 80%, 80% plus of Ukrainians thinking that Ukraine needs to join NATO. And it's because for them, the threat of Russian aggression is the most real. They don't have to, just imagine it. They can experience it any day. They go out their home and they hear the air sirens. Even if they don't engage with an explosion every day, the war is ever present in very little ways, through checkpoint guards, through air raid sirens, or the occasional explosion, depending on where you live. So I think for them that it really pushed them hard, and seeing that type of aggression in Europe again, I think was enough to wake up a lot of people, especially on Russia's border. And if you're on Russia's border and you're not in a defensive alliance structure, if you're not in Russia's alliance structure and you're not in NATO, which has been a proven recipe to stop Russia from invading you, no NATO state has ever been invaded by the Russians. That's just a discernible fact. Even if the Estonians, Latvians, and the Lithuanians would put up, most likely, just due to the size of the military, less resistance, or could put up less resistance than a fully mobilized Ukraine, because it's in an alliance structure. These states have yet to be aggressed upon in that manner. And they feel relatively safe when it comes to that defensive structure, in a way that Finland couldn't feel in the same way until it became a NATO member state. And I feel like the Finnish people just looked at it practically. A lot of it wasn't probably that ideological. I know for a lot of people it was ideological, that they supported democracy in Ukraine. But I've talked to others that don't really even care necessarily that much about Ukraine, but they care more about, we're on Russia's border. This is a lot more real for us. Let's just be practical about this. We're already working with them. We're already integrated in so many ways with the defensive structures and type of weapons we use. Might as well join.
Yeah, that does also make sense in the Finnish context. I think the reason why many people hadn't supported membership until 2022 was because, don't fix what's broken. Our sort of semi-pragmatic, I don't want to call it neutrality because it wasn't neutral, even formally neutral, ever since we joined the EU. But and there was never a sort of a question about what team we would pick if push came to shove. But there was still this sort of we just didn't want to join because he had worked for so long. But everything changed in 2022. And I remember our president, I tend to agree with his perspective. Right? I'm sure that this might have affected the administration and the government and the way they thought about the question as well. Because like before, the message from Russia had been that, yeah, we respect your defense political choices. Like you do cooperation with NATO, that's fine. We don't exactly like that, but we respect your sovereignty and we respect your right to do so. But then in 2022, they said quite directly, or actually in 2021, late 2021, they said, we do not want NATO to spread further. We do not want Finland to join NATO, which is a complete shift in messaging, because that takes away Finnish sovereignty, like explicitly takes away Finnish sovereignty. And that was kind of ironically even, that was the flip in thinking here, like, oh, okay, they don't respect our sovereignty. We do need to pick a side here to sort of cover our ass.
I think maybe it was kind of like, it kind of kicked, and I hate to use this analogy, kind of kicked the Finns in the ass to make a decision. Because if the Russians are now putting it up to question as to if this will be a political question, if the Finns will have this option, they're trying to say that you don't have this option. For a lot of Finns, it's like, well, before we had no rush to decide. There was not really a need for us to jump into NATO because we could be out of it, we could be in it. It doesn't really matter which way because there's not this active threat on our border. But now with the Russians making it an issue with the Finns and then the preceding war on top of that, I think that was enough to turn the majority of the Finnish public and the Finnish government on the path of NATO membership. And I think even though right now there's still some problems with Swedish membership, inevitably I think they will become member states as well after these issues are ironed out. I have no reason to believe that this will be a long-term issue.
Yeah. We have many topics to cover on this episode, so I will get to those in a bit. But one more question about this. We weren't even supposed to talk about this, but this is very interesting already. Yes.
I'm having fun with this conversation because I don't get to talk to Finnish people about their perspective that often.
I'm happy to share if you have any questions yourself. But one more question about this, and this relates to... I don't know if this is a uniquely American perspective. It is not, but it's quite often heard from some sort of Ukraine skeptics. I don't know what to call them. And it's this whole thing about NATO expansion and phrasing it that way, that NATO is expanding, not that NATO is accepting sovereign member states who want to join. How are, and also some context for our listeners, you talk to these people a lot. You arrange debates.
Yes.
Discussion.
I debate them very often. I had a debate on the issue Monday on the Wagner coup and the fallout of that. And we talked about like if age should increase and stuff. I talk about this. I have a debate with them probably once every 1 to 2 weeks because I try to have an active conversation with people I disagree with. I think that's important in a democracy.
That is very, very admirable. And I also want to talk to you about that specifically because that's a really interesting part of your content table. But yes, how do these people, if if I'm allowed to call them that, sort of explain Finnish and the eventual Swedish membership? Because at least from our perspective, it was quite obvious that it had nothing to do with NATO. Any kind of NATO forceful imperialism. Like it was a very, very, very willing choice made by a super majority of Finnish society. Even so, there was actually a funny tweet when because Turkey was the last parliament to ratify our membership, and a lot of people, including me, were watching the live parliamentary sort of session in Turkish without subtitles, just waiting for the vote, just looking at Turkish politicians having speeches on whatever issues that we had no idea about, just waiting until we could see the ratification. And that was a wake-up call for a lot of people, like, what am I doing? But that's only because we're waiting so much to become members of NATO. So, okay, so that's at least my perspective and 80% of Finn's perspective. So how does that sort of mesh together with this view of imperialist NATO expansion?
So I think most people haven't really thought that deep into Swedish or Finnish NATO membership. I think most Americans, when they think about Finnish history, it is really just that World War II perspective. And so most of them be like, okay, we understand why they're joining. and they kind of just ignore it. It's not really talked about that much. The Finnish perspective and as to why they joined NATO, or the fact that it was overwhelming support, that isn't talked about as much. It seems to be the main arguments I have to engage with are twofold. The first argument will always be, why are we spending money on this? That we have our own issues. We have to deal with the homeless, disabled veterans who are drug addicted or dealing with PTSD, or any number of group that has it off worse than the Ukrainians in their mind, or has it off bad in the United States, and we have to be taking care of our own, right? And that focus, I can always I can talk to them in two ways on that issue. The first way I can talk to them about is, I don't believe the homeless are going to be using Abrams tanks to house themselves. I don't believe the PTSD veterans need Javelin missiles to deal with their mental health issues. A lot of these weapons, a lot of these things have already been budgeted for, already been made, some of them from the Vietnam War era. So I don't see the issue with sending it overseas. Not to mention, I think long term, having another strong, resource plentiful ally in Europe that we can help rebuild and build a strong economic relationship with can help America rejuvenate a trade relationship with Europe and try to rebuild a country that we can have a better relationship with down the road. Now, I can also go into like a more selfish route, but I never really feel the need to. The other point, and this point I think angers me more, because the first point I think most people can understand. I want to take care of my neighbors, me and my own. Everybody can understand that to some degree. The second argument is a lot more, I think, nefarious, and that is, this is Russia's backyard. This is Russia's area. This is historic Russian lands. This is the area they've ruled over historically and want to control. They are a powerful country, and powerful countries, great powers, will naturally dominate the area around them. And there's no business in NATO or in the United States or any Western power messing around in Russia's backyard. We wouldn't want them in our backyard. Now, the problem I have with this argument is the Soviets didn't accept that when it came to Cuba. They were able to produce a defensive relationship with Cuba, because after we soured our relationship by backing a horrible despotic dictatorship in Cuba, the Cuban people soured on a relationship with the United States. There was a revolution there. Of course, I don't like the Cuban government very much, but the reason that we had a negative relationship with Cuba is partially our own. And they didn't develop the defensive relationship with the Soviets. And we had to, in the long run, accept that fact. We engaged in embargoes and we tried to reject it, but our invasions failed. And eventually, after these failures, we had to accept that fact that we could not go into Cuba and just decide the government for them. And that's a fact that I believe the Russians have to accept as well, that in the 21st century, the age of empires invading other countries to try to ethnically cleanse the territory and create, in their mind, a Novorossiya, these greater territories, and empire building in the most blatant and bloodthirsty manner should not be accepted in anywhere in the world. And European powers and European countries, for good reason, don't want this type of instability to be reintroduced in the continent, in what is now the largest war in Europe since World War II, started by the Russian government and pushed forward by the Russian government time and time again. In 2014, they pushed it forward by invading Crimea. And for the next 8 years, they pushed it forward by funneling weapons and munitions into the Donbass. In 2022, they pushed it forward by then invading the totality of Ukraine. That's not even talking about Chechnya or Georgia. I don't think that great powers have a right to abuse their neighbors just because they are powerful. And if nation states want to build alliance structures or strong international law or basis in IR on the a strong international legal community to fight back against this type of thing. Sorry, I'm stuttering. Fight back against the type of thing. I think that's just. I think that's correct, and I understand their position. That's what the Estonians did. That's what the Latvians did, and that's what the Lithuanians did. And now that's a settled question. Nobody's saying, "Oh, should Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania be part of Russia?" Everybody's now accepted that they're allowed to be part of the European community. They're allowed to have their democracy. But for the Ukrainians, because they didn't get on the ship fast enough, that's an open question. I would like that question to be settled very soon.
Yeah, very well put. So. Speaking of Ukraine, you are there right now. You're not from there. You're from the United States, from Maryland, I assume. You were born there, at least. I don't know if you live there.
Born and raised in Maryland. Born and raised.
Nice. I read that somewhere. I've read up on you a little bit. But now, now you live in. You now live in Kiev.
Yes, I live in Kiev. I have an apartment in Kiev, and I spend a lot of time in the countryside outside of Kiev. But I travel all across the country when I get a story or I get a tip or a fixer gives me a good proposal.
So what was that choice to go to
The
Kiev?
choice the choice to go to Kiev or live in Kiev. I chose Kiev because I think it's right in the center of the country. So if there's a story in Lviv, I can get to Lviv relatively fast enough. If there's a story in Kherson, I can get to Kherson relatively fast enough. Same with Kharkiv. Whereas if I was staying in Lviv, that's where I originally stayed. The first time I was here, it took a lot longer to travel. It was a much bigger hassle. By the time I got there, I was a lot more tired. Definitely if I was traveling in a car, not in like a train carriage. And so it was just a lot easier being in Kiev logistically in the country.
Mm.
And I also think the countryside's very pretty.
Yes. Oh, man, I hope I will have the chance to go. I mean, I really want to visit Ukraine now. But anyway, that's another point. Why did you decide to go to Ukraine? I mean, you are a war journalist. You've been covering the war for over a year now, for, I mean, all of its duration. But that must have been it must have been a big personal choice.
Um, I had always had an interest in foreign policy. I had always had an interest in international affairs. While I was still in high school, I actually went to the University of Maryland in a specialty program to study IR there. And ever since then, I've been very hooked. But before that, I was following the Syrian civil war using open source intel, whatever I could find online. While it was in like late middle and early high school, I was having an interest in that. And so I always had an interest in covering foreign affairs. And I did advise two congressional campaigns on foreign affairs to the best of my ability. And so I had, I had an interest in this career path. I had an interest in covering it. And when the war happened and I had my channel, I had already started Twitch streaming and talking about politics. My audience particularly enjoyed my coverage or liked the way that I covered it, liked the way that I talked about it, liked the way that I interviewed people about it. And so they donated a few $1,000s more than what I was used to. I was like, oh, this is actually a decent payday for this. And when I looked at this money, I knew that I wasn't going to last forever because, the news fades. But I thought maybe if I improve my coverage, then I can make enough money off of this to fund what would be quite an expensive project of doing this for maybe a few months. But then when I came over, I got very personally, emotionally invested. I got very personally interested in doing this type of journalism on the ground. I got a very positive response from my community, and I got a very positive response from the people that I've worked with. And I've been doing it ever since. And I've been working with Offbeat Research. I've been working with other journalists here on the ground for ever since the 2022 invasion started, really.
Yeah, your channel has really seemed to have taken off. I remember a conversation you had with Destiny. Was it almost a year ago where you were wondering about the future of your channel? But right now you must be pretty happy the turn it has taken.
Yeah, I remember when I first made this commitment because I'm talking about the personal interest I'm taking. I also have somewhat of an ideological commitment because I do believe that Ukrainians are fighting for their democracy and they have a right to rule themselves. And I have a lot of friends here as well. So I'm also very personally committed. And so I had this professional interest and I had this professional commitment and also a personal interest. And so once I was hooked in all those ways, I knew that I was not going to be letting go of this. I think 2 or 3 months in, I was like, I feel like I'm going to be doing this for at least to the end of this war and possibly doing the work like this for the rest of my life, because this is deeply, deeply fascinating and interesting to me. And I enjoy the work. When I say I enjoy the work, that's a weird thing to say because it's very dreary work, but I find it satisfying. And so when I was making this turn though in the type of work that I did, the type of content I put out on my channel, I used to host internet debates and I used to have discussions with all types of people, some people serious about politics and other people who were just clowns, to be completely honest. And I'm not saying that it was like completely worthless. There's an entertainment factor to it, but I felt like the type of work I was doing now was more personally fulfilling. And I thought I was contributing more through my work. And I thought I was doing stuff that had a longer standing. That's something I could look back to in 10, 20 years and I could be proud of. And so when I was making this shift, though, a lot of my old community members, they were like, I'm not really interested in this. I wanted the silly internet debates and only the silly internet debates. I don't like you mixing it with this more serious content. And I did get some pushback of people saying, maybe you should turn around. This is a lot more financially rewarding because all you have to do is you need to sit in your house. You don't need to take a week off or a month off to go do the stuff with the miners or go film with this crew. And you don't have to pay for all the camera equipment. You don't got to pay for the fixers. You don't got to pay for the travel costs and all this other stuff. You just got to sit in your apartment. But I had already been hooked, and when I decided that I was going to do it, I was stuck to it, and nobody could pull me off of it. And now, though, I feel like I'm a lot more stable in what I'm doing, and I'm starting to see a lot more traction again. And I'm happy I stuck to it.
Yes, happy you did. How did going to Ukraine change your coverage or change your perspective? Is I think the question underlying. I mean, you've been following open source intelligence and probably seeing a lot of quite graphic stuff even before you moved there. But like seeing the people's faces and looking in their eyes, that must be a different experience. And so how did that sort of make the war real for you?
The coming here changed my perspective in a lot of ways. A few ways that it changed was how I viewed narratives about the war. I never really bought many of the Russian narratives of the war, but just because of their presence in media, they still affect you in certain ways. And when I come to the country, out to the countryside in eastern Ukraine, and I was filming with anti-tank crews near the front line, and every single person there was speaking Russian, while Russia was claiming to fight a war of liberation for the Russian speakers that they were going to have to fight in this open field. I think it hit me most clearly the irony of like the Russian claims about the war. And so a lot of stuff was shaken out of me like that, completely shaken out of me. Even if I didn't give it much credence before the war, now I give it no credence because it was completely almost like a baptism of Ukrainian, of the Ukrainian countryside and culturally wise connected to the war. On the other end, when it comes to the humanization of the war, becoming personal friends with people, it becomes really real when you're talking to your friends with somebody who have lost friends with somebody, when you're friends with somebody who's lost these family members, when you're friends with somebody who got hurt, when you're friends with somebody who's lost their home or lost their job or has been affected by the wars in a million more ways than just the most tragic circumstances of losing your family members, but just economically being affected, how they've had to make cuts in the family budget, how they can no longer visit their family members because their family members are too close to the front line or they're halfway across the world because they're displaced. The war becomes a lot more real because it's around you, and it's no longer just like a words on a page. And I think that was the thing that disturbed me most when it came to the reality I knew in the United States and reality I knew here. Because if an airstrike happened or a artillery strike happened, and I'm in the United States and I'm reading about it, it's just like 5 injured, 3 dead. But when I was in the city of Mykolaiv, when the Kherson counteroffensive started, the Russians started panicking. They started shelling the entirety of the city center. And we were there as civilians started to get killed by artillery bombardments purely caused by the Russians panicking, not shelling at military installations, but just panicking. And the shells were falling very close to us. We got very lucky, but other people did not get as lucky. But then at the end of the day, after running away from these shells all day, many of them falling within like 100 to 50 feet of me, I look in the New York Times and it just says 3 dead, 20 injured. And that's the only description you got of this very tragic event. And that only motivated me more to do my best to record as much as possible, document as much as possible so that there's a stronger historical record than just, a single line.
Mm. What about the local Ukrainians you've talked to and gotten to know? How has this changed their perspective and worldview? Because, I can imagine that a war like this is, and this might even sound frivolous to use this word, it's mildly put, can be radicalizing to experience something like this. How are people staying sane, ideologically and mentally?
Ideologically, everyone here hates Russia, and that's just to be expected. If you were to go to any country that's being invaded by another country, they hate Russia. Yeah. Now, whether it means they hate Russians, that's a different story. If you talk to somebody, other people will say that this is caused by the Russian people because they support Vladimir Putin, which is true. The majority of Russians do support the president. Not all of them. Not all of them. There are dissidents. There are people who oppose them, and so they'll connect that hatred also to the Russian people. And that's in an area where you still can understand their mindset, but if you get to the extremes of that, that can be dangerous. But I haven't seen anybody to the extremes of that to the point where they're like advocating for war crimes or anything like that. It seems to mostly just be resentment for the types of things that are happening for their own country, and they want it to stop. Whereas on the other side, when it comes to you said radicalization ideologically, what was the other type of radicalization?
I don't know, just mental stress. I don't know what else to call it.
But yeah, how to deal with the mental stress is difficult because everybody has different ways of coping with it. I personally deal with it through trying to just tell jokes or like listen to comedy. In very stressful situations, I will sometimes be cracking very inappropriate jokes. And when I say inappropriate jokes, I don't mean like they're offensive. It just feels kind of inappropriate due to the timing of the joke. Other people I know, they have religious items. Something that was given to me, I have this little bracelet on my wrist. It was blessed by an Orthodox priest, and a friend of mine's mom gives it to everybody she can because she genuinely believes it protects them. And I keep it as a keepsake because it's sweet even if you don't believe in the religiosity of it, it's sweet to think about somebody, looking out for you that way in their own way. And so that's another thing I see people do, have little protection keepsakes and things like that. But a lot of people desire normalcy, desire, their habits. If they like to read comic books before the war, they're going to try to escape in the comic books now. If they liked video games before the war, they're going to try to escape in the video games now. If they like to go out to restaurants and eateries and bars, they're going to try to do that as much as possible now, or they want to do that as an escape now. The difficulty is, depending on where you live, that type of normalcy is nearly impossible to find, definitely if you're near the front line. And even if you're in Kiev, that normalcy can still be interrupted by rocket strikes, by air raid sirens, or finding out about how the war has affected people in other locations in the country.
Yeah, especially since the air raids and the rocket launches, they usually coincide. They usually happen in the night, if I'm not mistaken, when people should be sleeping.
Recently, sometimes they do it in the daytime, but in my experience here, it's usually been in the nighttime. Every time we've had rockets pass over where I'm staying right now, it's been during the nighttime. Most of the strikes seem to happen at night. It's harder for air defense to strike it down during the nighttime because if you're aiming with only your eyes and it's the middle of the night, it can be harder to see it.
Yeah, and also important holidays in Ukraine, and important sort of just days that you should normally be used to sort of celebrate something or commemorate something or.
The Russians seem to have, I think, a lot of times specifically timed their bombing in order to counter a kind of morale boost. Yeah. For example, anytime the Russians look in any way weak, they'll do some bombing runs or they'll start launching a few missiles. Right after the Wagner coup happened, or actually during the midst of the Wagner coup, they actually fired a few missiles in our area, and it flew very close over a building because they were trying to make sure that they didn't look too weak as Wagner was marching towards Moscow, and what could have been a coup could have been a military mutiny. Who knew at the time? But that also happened during important holidays. It also happened during other Ukrainian victories, during victories in Kherson and victories in the Kharkiv Oblast. They really hyped up the bombing campaign, and in order to strangle the support structure, like electricity, the heat, the gas supply, stuff that makes it easier for Ukrainians to live their day to day, or that is necessary for them to live during the winter. They really did want to freeze out the Ukrainians. I was in Kharkiv, and I was very close to the electrical grid when they were trying to knock it out.
And I'm guessing this Antimoral operation has the opposite effect.
Often it does. I meet very few people who engage with this type of bombing, and their conclusion is like, okay, we should just give the Russians what they want, whatever makes them go away. Most of them don't want to. Most people don't want to give in to a bandit. Most people don't want to give in to a bully. And if this person is terrorizing you, the last thing you want to do is just reward them for them terrorizing you. And I mean, that's one of the factors, but I think the main factor for most people here is they don't want to abandon the people who are in occupied territory, and they don't want to abandon their land and communities that are still occupied. And of course, it's difficult for many people to even think about giving in after seeing what happened in Bucha, Izium, with all these massacres and war crimes that have occurred, and the war crimes that I've seen. It's hard to imagine sitting down and signing that territory over, because let's say you abandon those people to the Russians. Why are they going to stop doing those war crimes? Are they going to stop doing these massacres in occupied territory? Are they going to stop throwing Tatar activists in rivers after killing them in torture chambers? Most people don't believe that the Russians are going to change how they treat the occupied territory, so they don't want to abandon the occupied territory and the people in it.
Yeah. You mentioned Prigozhin's mutiny. We should talk about that a little bit, because, what the hell happened? So maybe it's maybe I should say that this is being recorded on the 28th of June, 4:40 Eastern European time. So if anything happens the next minute, we will know that we did not know about this.
Yeah, President Shoigu. Yeah,
right, exactly. Perhaps a short rundown. You did a great summary on your Dylan Burns Live channel, VOD, that can be seen. Don't have the title here right now, but just go check it out. Just a rundown of what happened. What, for those who don't know, what was the pretext for the march to Moscow?
So that video I did covering most of the information about the coup itself only went into even some of the background of it, and it still was an hour and a half. There's so much information to consume. There's so much stuff that's still being revealed constantly. We're now getting reports from U.S. officials that Surovikin, General Armageddon, could have possibly knew about the coup beforehand, which could really change the dynamic of internal Russian politics if that's true. I mean, of course, it's U.S. officials, so there's a bias there. I have yet to see any journalists, confirm that. But when it comes to the pretext, Wagner, and specifically Yevgeny Prigozhin, has had a public feud with the Russian MOD ongoing for a very long time now.
Ministry of Defense.
And the premise of the feud basically is that the MOD, yes, the Russian Ministry of Defense. The premise of the feud basically is that the Ministry of Defense is trying to undercut Wagner. This is Yevgeny Prigozhin's narrative. They're undercutting Wagner. They're trying to make it so Wagner fails because they don't want Wagner to shine after it's had so many successes out in the battlefield and taking Bakhmut. And so he'll say, MOD is trying to undercut my ammunition shipments. They're trying to undercut my artillery shipments, and he will show this this abuse by the MOD. Which, by the way, I think a lot of the things he says about them and how they're targeting Wagner is just like 100% verifiably true. But a lot of it is also hard to know because, again, he's coming from his perspective, and he's going to make them look as bad as possible every time, and he's going to say he's as persecuted as ever. But the rivalry is real. The MOD does not want Yevgeny Prigozhin to be too independent. They didn't want Wagner to be too independent, and they didn't want it to become too powerful. And as it had, tens of thousands of prisoner soldiers and experienced contractors from Syria, they very much were so. And so there was a motivation from Gerasimov and Shoigu to undercut Prigozhin because they didn't want him to get too powerful, too independent, and too strong and outside of their control. Where before he was doing mostly mercenary work in Africa, now with all these prisoner soldiers and bloated budgets from the war in Ukraine, because he did get a massive funding increase during the war in Ukraine, the balance of power was starting to tip maybe somewhat in too much in Prigozhin's favor. And so they tried to reel him in, and it was through possibly the cutting of ammunition shipments. It depends how much you believe Prigozhin. It was also in a new MOD contract proposal that was the real sticking point behind this, in my opinion, which would have had it so that the Russian Ministry of Defense had much more power over Wagner and over Prigozhin's mercenaries. And that was supposed to go through actually 3 days from now. It was supposed to go through on the 1st of July. And so Prigozhin, seeing the walls closing in, his Telegram rants attacking them not being enough to, push them back, even though it did get a lot of more vitriol directed at Shoigu and Gerasimov and did get him a somewhat loyal fan base online, it was not enough to push back against the real political power these people had. And so One day, supposedly, we still don't know. It's still murky, and enough evidence hasn't been provided. All the evidence not Shoigu, but Prigozhin has provided is a video from the immediate aftermath where I think there was one body shown. But he says that 34 Wagner fighters were killed in a rocket strike directed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Again, the only video provided is like one in the immediate aftermath where somebody's kind of panting and panicking, and there's one body. Now, if there's 34 bodies, where are the other bodies? Who knows? We don't even know if the MOD did that or not. So we're just saying that the initiating thing that actually Prigozhin uses as justification, we don't even know if that even happened. We don't even know if that's real. He did not provide sufficient evidence. Anyway, using that moment, he then takes convoys, marches on Rostov, takes Rostov with very little resistance, which should be extremely worrying to the Putin regime, that the border guards didn't stop him, the Rosguardia, the militarized police force didn't stop him, the National Guard didn't stop him, and any soldiers they came across didn't stop him. They didn't put up any physical resistance. Now, why is this? Well, you can't say that a few of them probably have sympathies with some of Yevgeny Prigozhin's message of, hey, this war has been mismanaged. And while he was marching on the Capitol, he was saying that this war is built on lies. 1,000 people are dying every day. It's been terribly mismanaged. The Gerasimov and Shoigu are killing our boys, and we will not allow it to happen anymore because they're so corrupt. And a lot of the things he was saying was true. And there is a strength in the truth. What was the thing that Kissinger once said? And I hate Henry Kissinger, but he said it also has the convenience of being true. And I think that is the case with a lot of the things Yevgeny Prigozhin was saying. So there was some people who sympathized with him. There were some people who are probably just politically apathetic, who are just going to make a wait and see approach. Why are they going to get themselves killed for these officials in Shoigu and Gerasimov? For a lot of them didn't even think they were defending Putin. They thought they were going to be defending Shoigu and Gerasimov because that's the messaging that Prigozhin is going off of. But then there's a last group, and I do want to point this out because if you arm a bunch of rapists and murderers, take them out of prison and arm them, give them guns, and have them be led by some of the most dangerous mercenaries in the world from Syria and Africa, who, while most people know about the sledgehammers from this war, they were executing people with sledgehammers in Syria, beating them to death. Syrian fighters that were forcefully conscripted and didn't want to fight, they would beat those fighters to death with sledgehammers. And they've been doing it in this war as well to their own fighters. And so you're a Russian cop who's been told to stop a Wagner convoy that has a ton of experience fighting in Ukraine, possibly some of them experience fighting Syria, and are known to execute people with sledgehammers, one of the most notorious military organizations on the planet. And you're going to stop them as a Russian cop? No, you're not going to get sledgehammered in the middle of the road. You're going to step out of the way. And so I do think that fearsome reputation also made a lot of people stand down. I don't know if you just want me to keep telling the story or
no. What about I have a question actually. Yeah. What about you mentioned cops, but the Southern Military District has their headquarters in Rostov.
Yes,
and a large. Sort of military. It's a very important place for the Russian military in terms of Ukraine.
Unbelievably important. It is vital for the Russian military effort. I don't know how they would be able to supply Donetsk, Luhansk, and much of their military forces in Ukraine without the Southern Military District. Of course, for a day or two, they're going to have ammo reserves in place already, so it's not like the immediate stopping of the shipping of weapons is going to do anything immediately. But long term, if they were able to really hold on to it, the supply lines to Donetsk and Luhansk are vitally important for the Russian war effort. Not to mention, like you said, the Southern Military District HQ is there, which commands not only the area around Rostov, but also the area around Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Crimea, Zaporozhye. The entirety of the Russian occupation falls under the Southern Military District HQ. So this city was vitally important. It was a city of 1.1 million people. For comparison, that's roughly the size of Dallas, Texas.
Right.
It's the 11th largest city in Russia. It's a major city that they took over with basically no resistance and a few thousand people.
So not only are you saying that the local law enforcement authorities were maybe scared, maybe unwilling to intervene, but also the Russian army. Could this be? Yeah. Could this have something to do with their sort of personal convictions, like the personal convictions of the officers and soldiers, or just the sort of sluggishness of the Russian command line? command structure?
I think it's a few things. Like I said before, I think some of them probably do have personal convictions about the war. We've seen some people, at least recently, we saw like one FSB soldier and two furries get arrested in Moscow recently because they went onto the street with guns in support of Wagner. So, you know, Wagner has a lot of diverse support throughout society. But besides that, I think a lot of them, well, yeah, the furries, of course. Russian furries are Team Wagner, I guess. But also, there are a lot of people who are just blatantly terrified of Wagner. I mean, they built a reputation on being brutal, terrible war criminals that the Russian government up until now wouldn't even really that much publicly associate with, or at least confirm their relationship with directly as an arm of the Russian government. At least that was their intentions in Syria and Africa and a lot of times around the world. They were supposed to do the more dirty work of the Russian government, and so they could have some like veneer of separability. They could separate themselves from the group. Now, instead, you have Vladimir Putin on state television saying, we've given them billions and billions and billions of dollars, and then they stab us in the back. And it really just shows how much the situation has changed from all these shell companies that Wagner used to try to shield their involvement in different war crimes and atrocities and the Russian government's involvement with them, to Vladimir Putin yelling on state TV, yes, we've given them billions of dollars, and this is what they do to us.
This is this is very interesting. Most people, I think, know more or less what happened with the march to Moscow. I mean, Wagner sent a big convoy from Rostov to Moscow, and on the way actually shot down Russian military aircraft.
The Russian Air Force was the only force that was actually loyal enough to Putin to actually shoot at Wagner. The other ones could have been the Chechens, but when they went, and the TikTok soldiers, once again, they get all the way to where the action could be, and then they stop and then do no fighting, then afterwards brag about it. So they didn't really do anything. They were supposed to apparently take Rostov from the Wagner guys, but they didn't. But on the march towards Moscow, the only force that engaged them was the Russian Air Force, and they were shot down for it. 7 Russian aircraft, including command aircraft, were shot down by Wagner with anti-air equipment. Now, Prigozhin afterwards has said this was because they were fired upon, and there has been footage that has been released. I don't know if all of it has been confirmed, but that does show what looks like the Russian Air Force actually bombing them. But Wagner decided to respond to that by shooting down the planes. And it must be quite bizarre to be the families or of those, Russian airmen, or be a Russian pilot right now, and being part of the one branch of the government that actually was willing to publicly fight with your mercenary murderers who are on a war path towards your capital, and you get rewarded by kind of being brushed aside and like nobody's going to be held accountable, nobody's going to be arrested. And that's what the Russian government's public position on this is. And they've just like, oh yeah, it's kind of regrettable that 20 Russian airmen died.
Yeah, I think we can't underline it enough how crazy it is that Wagner shot down Russian military aircraft in Russia.
Unbelievably crazy. This is the type of stuff that you would imagine somebody gets executed on like state TV for, like usually in a dictatorship, or would have hell and fury rain down upon him. And Putin initially during the March of Moscow, that's what he tried to indicate. He said, I'm going to punish all these people who are engaged in this coup against my government, who's engaged in this revolt against my government. He called it a revolt. The FSB said they were looking for Prigozhin to arrest him. They had arrest warrants for him from 12 to 20 years for treason for this mutiny. And then after a conversation with Lukashenko, all of a sudden, Prigozhin doesn't go to prison. None of the people who actually engage in the coup or shout down the planes go to prison. He's saying that the people who were engaged in the coup can either join with the Russian MOD, they could go home to their families, or they could even go with Lukashenko to Belarus, which is where Lukashenko went to, possibly live off in exile. We don't know all the details of the agreement still, even days later. I would think that he would probably have a deep interest in going back to his bread and butter of mercenary work in Africa, where he can get the money from the mineral rights and in Syria and the Central African Republic from the gold mining operations they're engaged in there. But if Prigozhin really gets off this scot-free, they can like take away their heavy equipment. They could even take away the majority of their mercenaries. Putin looks weak by having to make a deal in the first place. By not crushing them immediately and totally, he has showed that he is not invincible. He is not a god. He is infallible, and he is somebody that can be challenged. And people, even if immediately there's not going to be any other coup, even if this doesn't necessarily mean that Putin's government is going to collapse, Russians are now thinking more about more than ever a post-Putin Russia. And the people around Putin, the oligarchs, the MOD, the Siloviki, the most hard and soft Siloviki, the security state, they're all thinking about, should we be making contingency plans? Should we be possibly planning what Prigozhin tried to do with our money that is a lot more plentiful than what he has, or with our oligarchical ties? Because he did a military push. Could we do something maybe more politically, something more oriented domestically, that isn't as out and about as his was? Maybe like an assassination, maybe this, maybe that. And I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying that they're definitely thinking about it and talking about it. And that is very different than what the culture was like before in Russia, which was this guy has a stranglehold on the country, but now it feels like his grip is slipping.
Right. The only sort of definite thing that can be said at this point, I guess, is that Putin's hold on power seems not as unconditional as it was before.
It's the weakest as it's ever been, and since the year 2000. I mean, ever since the war in Chechnya, this is the weakest his regime has ever looked.
Yeah. So what do we know about this? Some leaks, or I don't know if they can be called leaks, but it's like some reports from the negotiations between Lukashenko and Prigozhin have been released, I think. I don't know if they've been verified yet, but it seems like a big part of the leverage that Lukashenko held was what didn't happen, total destruction. That if you had come any closer, we would have destroyed all of you. Do you think that would have been a realistic possibility?
That's what Putin's saying, but we have no idea. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing pictures of Rosguardia on the streets of Moscow, like on the embankments close to roads, ready to defend the city. We see like what looks to be FSB and security service people with rocket launchers near choke points. But could they have stopped Wagner? Maybe, maybe not. But I don't think if Wagner really went into the throes of a civil war that they could have won it. I don't think there's a situation where they take Moscow, even if they took it and they were able to take it, where that means necessarily that Putin's government would collapse. It probably would be the most destabilized Putin government could be, because then people would then have to question like, what side are we choosing? We actually have to now choose sides very quickly because now it's a full coup. But there's a decent chance he probably would have been crushed, like 90 to 95% chance he would have been crushed. And so I think he made the tough call to turn around, given the circumstances. But if he was to push on, it probably would have been a death sentence unless he was able to completely take over Putin's government. But this was never, I think, meant to necessarily take over Putin's government. But this is me assuming, of course. This is my assumption. And so this is not fact. We don't know this for sure. But I am of the belief, like many other scholars and analysts, that this was meant to specifically just challenge Putin and Gerasimov, and that if he could cause a crisis, then he could get more leverage within Putin's government, and he could stop Wagner from being dissolved and get out of this box situation he felt he was in from Gerasimov and Shoigu, like isolating Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin more and more. And so I don't think there was ever a threat of Putin being overthrown. But I don't think that necessarily would have led to Putin's government collapse. But I don't know if they could have stopped them from taking Moscow. And that's crazy.
Do you think they would have considered this is also such a weird question that you can only speculate on this, but like considering like a ballistic missile attack outside of Moscow?
A ballistic missile attack outside of Moscow? I mean, the thing that I would be, honestly, the thing that I would be scared of the most, looking at the situation, is what would the soldiers that are deployed to Ukraine immediately do? I think if Moscow was taken, if let's think of this doomsday scenario for the Russians where Moscow is taken, what do the Russian soldiers in Ukraine do? I think that would probably be the main deciding factor. Yeah. Do they immediately pull back from Ukraine in its entirety to protect the regime? Or do they stay in Ukraine and try to hold the front line, which might feel like an impossible task if you no longer have your center of government power? right? I think that would be the main deciding factor of the survivability of Putin's regime past that point. I think everything else would be, I don't know, like window dressing. But this is just me. This is me not as a military expert, just speculating. Like I assume that would be one of the main factors, since the main thing that was exposed here from a military perspective is that the Russians seemingly don't have much in reserves to pull out to stop an engagement like this. They don't have much of a rear. And so they would have to regain their rear with military deployments from Ukraine.
Right. Okay, let's return to something that we might have a bit more of a tangible perspective on, which is how have people responded to this? Obviously, we don't have official polling data. Why would they do official polls on this? But what is your hunch, and what have you seen regarding public opinion and how it is split regarding this conflict? There was a video you posted about a Telegram post where people had voted on or sort of reacted with emojis to a post.
This is the problem. Is like, it's not like we're gonna get a public on TV poll of like, here's how many people who approved of trying to possibly overthrow Putin's regime and engage in a mutiny. They're not going to display that on state TV. So you kind of have to gauge your reaction from like word of mouth and like online like commentary, but that's still so disconnected from everyday Russian life, because what you see on Telegram is very different than what you'll see in like the bar, or if somebody, you know, is really honest with you, or the type of stuff you hear on the street. So these methods are always going to be improper. But what is true is that there are people who supported what Wagner did. And it wasn't only the pro-Wagner military Telegram channels. People did come out on the street and hand them food, hand them flowers, hand them drinks. Now, I do need to be honest about one fact, though. I think this is really important, that Wagner was trying to organize people to do that, to help them. There was videos coming out of Wagner like calling people in Moscow to come out on the streets and like come out to support them. So they were trying to coordinate that support, but there were people who were willing to do that. There were people who were willing to come out to the street and support Wagner, even though they were technically defying Putin's government, even past the point where Putin said that these were mutineers, these were people betraying the country. They still had people on the street supporting them. And if you look at the announcement reaction of what Prigozhin originally said, like, hey, we're doing the coup, or not. He didn't say we're doing the coup, but like all of his criticisms that we're doing this March of Justice, it had a very more positive reaction on Telegram. It has a much more positive reaction on Telegram than his announcement if he's calling it off. There was a lot of clown emojis, man, a lot of clown emojis. Again, it's not the most effective way of polling, but I can at least look at this and say that there were people who, for the Russian regime, were dangerously okay with what was going on.
Do you think that support comes from a direct support of what Wagner is doing and what they represent, or kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of situation? Because even in like Western commentary, there were undertones of like Prigozhin support during the march on Moscow. Not like
I don't think there was much actual like we like Prigozhin because Prigozhin is a good lead. Like that wasn't. It was all Prigozhin is causing chaos in the Russian political scene. Maybe this could be something that wakes up Russians. Maybe this is something that will cause enough chaos it'll be difficult for them to manage a war effort. This is something that shows that Putin's regime is valuable. This is all of the stuff that I saw from Western commentators. I've seen people talk about. There's people who are like the liberals for Prigozhin. I haven't seen that in reality, right? Maybe outside of a few Twitter memes, I don't know.
Tiny minority. I'll admit that. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't seen much of it. I do think that when it comes to the public support for Prigozhin, it's very populist and very right wing and very. We should be fighting the war more effectively. There is some commentary as of recent where he's like this whole, like during his march to Moscow, he said the war was built on lies. That is very dangerous commentary from Prigozhin that he probably couldn't have gotten away with outside of this scenario, even though he's gotten away with saying a lot of stuff, standing in front of bodies and pointing at the camera saying, this is all the Ministry of Defense fault, using real dead Russian mercenaries to try to make that point. So, but I do think that a lot of this just comes from hatred of the war's mismanagement, which has been impossible to cover up. You can't cover up the sinking of the Moskva. Even when the Russian government said, oh, no, it was just a storm that blew it up, even on state TV, they didn't believe it, where they were calling for revenge on Ukraine. Why do you need to call for revenge on Ukraine if Ukrainians didn't blow up the Moskva? And so they know that there's failings of the war. They know the war shouldn't have been this long. And so they have to have someone to blame. And Shoigu and Gerasimov are the easy options, the easy people to pick, not only because they are somewhat incompetent, but, it's not Putin.
Right. Do you think there's a chance here? Because you said earlier, quite correctly, perhaps, that Prigozhin was right about a lot of the criticisms that he sort of levied towards the government in Russia, at least from his
Absolutely.
perspective.
I think that's part of the reason why he was able to garner at least some support, is because, again, there's a dangerous power in the truth.
Yeah, there is, exactly. And so could this be a sort of dangerous reality check for Russians? Obviously, the Russian government isn't going to listen to any Western commentators commenting on how badly Russia is managing the war. But if it's Prigozhin, who has political clout.
Yeah, no, I don't think the average Russian babushka is turning into the Dylan Burns TV stream to hear me call Putin homophobic and be like, you know what, I changed my mind. We need to overthrow the government, become an anarchist. I do think that the power of the truth that he was talking about hasn't gone away. I do think that Russians are anxious about how stable things are, because one of the promises of Putin was stability. That was one of the main arguments you were going to hear from his base, was that stability. There seems to be, even amongst his base, a kind of at least distaste in their mouth about how the whole affair was handled. Why are Russian airmen dead? Why are there no repercussions for that? Why are the people who did the mutiny able to get away with it? The people who were happy for the mutiny, they're angry because they didn't get away with the mutiny completely. They didn't get to overthrow the government. They didn't get to get rid of Gerasimov and Shoigu. Everyone in Russia right now is upset. There's nobody in Russia that's really happy about how the situation has transpired, except for maybe Prigozhin, who's probably still on an adrenaline high. I think they all understand what this could mean for the future of Russia, either in a way that, this could undermine the war effort, or this could undermine the stability of Russia's government. And now there is definitely a jostling for power, which is going to be happening behind the scenes as people think more and more about that post-Putin Russia. And I think the Russian public are scared about getting caught in the middle of that.
So, okay, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is something that has been kind of left, it hasn't been covered as much recently, obviously, because of the march on Moscow, but it is still ongoing. How do you see what's the Dylan Burr situation report on the counteroffensive at this time?
Man, it's hard to say, because the last I heard was about 8 or 9 villages have been liberated in Zaporozhye. There's counteroffensives ongoing in Bakhmut. There's, of course, a counteroffensive going on in Zaporozhye, but it's all slow moving. And it's slow moving because the positions that the Russians have built up in Zaporozhye have been built up for about a year and a half now. They've dug deep trenches. They've got anti-tank ditches. They've got the Dragon Teeth anti-tank emplacements. These are stationary placements to try to stop armored vehicles from moving in. They've pre-calculated the artillery positions and the choke points. They've covered the areas and anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines, which have to be, of course, demined and removed either by sappers or by anti-mine explosives. And so these are not just like one trench that's like this. It's like multiple lines that are like this. And the Ukrainians have to break through that first line of defense and all of these other defensive positions as well that are built up like that. And it's going to be hard work. And they're engaged what is widely considered so far to be prepping operations, or operations to kind of prep the battlefield, taking higher positions on certain like hilltops and taking villages in the area. But the full force of the counteroffensive, this is what most analysts say, because again, I'm not within the Ukrainian government. The full force of the counteroffensive has yet to go underway, as the majority of the divisions that they've reserved for this operation have yet to go out into the field. And so I don't think that we've seen the counteroffensive fully play out yet. We're still in the early stages of it, and they seem to be in for the long run here. They're not going for like a quick Kharkiv breakthrough situation. We're going to see something that's a lot more similar to slow grinding warfare of Kherson before hopefully an eventual breakthrough.
I posed this question a few weeks ago to another guest. It was about sort of tempering expectations regarding the counteroffensive, because throughout the year, the hype has been building in Europe, in all the countries that have supported Ukraine throughout this war effort. And I guess there's always a risk that if your expectations are too high, or if they're too mismanaged, and they're not met, then might lead to some sort of political apathy or discontent. So, what is your perspective on how European voters who are in their own little way affecting the way in which the war is being played out? How should we temper our expectations regarding this counteroffensive?
This counteroffensive is very political. A lot of people are looking towards this counteroffensive as a way to make sure the West is still confident in Ukraine's ability to fight, that they have a chance of winning, and that they're not like backing a quote unquote forever war, that they want to see that the aid that they're giving to Ukraine is being used effectively and they're not just flushing the money down the toilet. Because if there is just footage of, there's going to be footage of burnt out Western vehicles on the Ukrainian plains, no matter what, they're going to be burnt out across the steppe. It's going to happen. That's part of warfare. But if you see those burnt out wrecks and you don't also see military victories to align with them, along with a lot of Russian burnt out wrecks, then there's going to be a problem. And that problem that's going to develop is people are thinking that they're wasting the money on this war. And not only are they wasting the money on this war, but then the violence is carrying on for nothing. And then the aid, the support for aid could slowly start to go down. That's the fear. In my mind, I think it's important to explain to people that, this is one counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are engaged in, that it could succeed, it could fail. It 100% could fail. That is a real possibility. I don't want anybody to walk away from this podcast thinking that Ukrainian victory is inevitable. And that's something that I always hear from Ukrainian soldiers that is expressed to me personally, which is our victory. And while they believe their liberation is inevitable, that doesn't necessarily mean any battle's victory is inevitable or this war's victory is inevitable. Because when you get into those type of slogans, that means that a lot of times you're not going to do the proper prep, or you're not going to send the proper amount of supplies that are necessary to win. If you don't talk about the honesty, we don't talk honestly about Ukraine's strategic position, and we just pretend it's better than it is, then we're not going to send them the proper amount of aid that will be necessary to win. So it is possible that this counteroffensive gets bogged down because of the strength of these entrenched positions. But I think that is the importance of the long-term security arrangements we need to make with Ukraine, and continuing the amount of aid that they get, so we can end the war as soon as possible, but also with the Ukrainians as prepared as possible to win, so they don't have to go into risky endeavors off of just the political persuasions or the political wins that are currently going on that could get people killed pointlessly. If they could prepare more concretely, if they could make better plans and concentrate on getting the best equipment and making sure those people are trained well in the best equipment, if that's what they can concentrate on instead of a U.S. election cycle, that would be best for the soldiers. Now, that's not political reality. Right. And everybody needs to understand that we have a very large and broad coalition, and keeping that together is difficult. But we can't just pretend that doesn't exist. But we need to acknowledge that this is one counteroffensive in a large war where the Ukrainians have had multiple successful counteroffensives. And usually in wars, you don't win every battle. So there's a possibility that there is a loss here, but that's the importance of all the aid that has still been confirmed to Ukraine, but has still not been delivered, and the aid that Ukraine is still asking for. So if this counteroffensive does succeed or does fail, they can follow up on it. If it succeeds, then they can follow up on it, maybe liberate Crimea and maybe liberate Donetsk and Luhansk. If it fails, then they can prepare and maybe try to attack at another location, or attack the same location again when they're more prepared after positions have been softened up or the Russian line has dwindled down due to manpower shortages or a lack of training. We can see the cracks forming in Russian society. And so I think right now the clearest example of, the strength of the Ukrainian cause in comparison to the Russian cause, and why, even if this counteroffensive doesn't succeed, you should still support Ukraine, is we can see the cracks in Russian society forming, but the Ukrainian society is still strongly unified. All the polling data suggests that, and the polling data in Ukraine is a lot easier, to make out of than in Russia due to, the human rights situation difference when we're talking about Ukraine and Russia. You can see it in the political sphere in Ukraine, and you can see it on the street in Ukraine, that they're a lot more unified. And even in the worst divided parts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when it comes to the Ukrainian side, like 2014, 2015, immediate aftermath, the Ukrainian military is failing. Even right sector would have never done what the Wagner Group did. The closest right sector did ever to doing something like this was political barbs with the current leadership of the Ukrainian government after Yanukovych fled, that they had public feuds with them, but it never boiled over to this point. And Ukraine is much more united than it was back then. And the Russians are much more divided than the Ukrainians ever were in 2014, 2015.
Okay, that's more than a sufficient answer. I want to do a complete pivot in topics right now, actually. U.S. politics. More specifically, the coming U.S. elections. Now, we're always interested in the U.S. elections, even here in Europe, and it seems like every election is more important than the previous one, and this is the next one is not an exception. There's a question about Trump, actually. What is going on with his indictment? Like, he's been it's the second indictment he's gotten. Suomeksi syytekirja. And so what's going on with that? And how does this sort of, if you're able to answer this in sort of tandem, how is this coinciding with what's happening with the Republican Party in general right now?
When you say what is going on with this indictment, I don't know how to answer it. So I'll just answer it with the most bare bones facts. So this guy has gotten in a lot of legal trouble, where not only when it comes to like lying about payments to like porn star Stormy Daniels, which is something that he's also gotten in legal trouble for when it comes to him being found liable for sexual assault in a recent case. But that was him being found for being civilly liable. So that's not him like serving any time in prison. Now, this time, this has to do with something which I find a little ironic, because Donald Trump campaigned very hard against Hillary Clinton on her emails. The idea that her emails were insecure, that it was a national security priority. And when he got into office, he increased the penalties for the Presidential Records Act. He made it so that the penalties for violating the act were worse. And then he immediately left office and violated the act in the fullest potential he possibly could. The act that he just increased the penalty for. It'd be like if I'm an anti-drunk driving advocate. Anybody who drunk drives should get 50 years in prison. And then you find me like hunched over a Bentley with a margarita in my hand. Like it's pretty embarrassing when you think of it from that angle, but that hasn't been talked about as much. So I just wanted to put a little tidbit there. But what happened is once he left the White House, he kept a lot of private government documents, classified government documents, some of which is a relationship to nuclear weapons. The exact nature of that has still not been completely revealed. And we're just going to, I think, have to wait and see for that. But a lot of classified materials, the main point. And while out of office, he then lied to the National Archives, who were requesting those documents back, saying, "Oh, I gave you all the documents back. Here you go. This is the rest of the documents." And he tried to hide documents that he still had, all while showing people who did not have clearance to see these documents. These documents, assumedly, can we? I don't know if I can cuss on here.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Assumedly for shits and giggles, it just being like, "Hey, look, did you know they wanted me to evade this country?" Just like showing random journalists and random staffers who did not have classification to see potential American war plans, which most people are assuming was for Iran, which that seems to be the direction of it, which is a story in and of itself, which hasn't gotten enough attention. But there's this complete disregard for not only the national security of these classified documents, but then the lying about it and how blatant it was and how stupid it was, for what a stupid reason, just to kind of like entertain people. And his justification for it has just been, well, I'm the president, therefore any documents I had are declassified. I can just declassify them by nature of being the president. And I've had to see popular, somewhat mainstream conservatives have to trot out and defend that asinine position that nobody really believes.
He wasn't
if
president,
that's the
though.
case. He wasn't the president anymore. He did not go through the proper declassification process. His belief is he can basically say, "Al kablam, I'm the president. That's declassified," no matter what, even if he's the former president of the United States. If that was the case, then couldn't he potentially like leak out the most sensitive nuclear secrets ever as former president of the United States and just be like, it's whatever. It is what it is. Does that mean George Bush right now could leak data on like U.S. spies and all this stuff for no reason whatsoever? We couldn't at all hold him legally responsible? That would be completely ridiculous. There is a formal process for this. His defense makes no sense. And so that's why it's so unbelievably comedic in my mind, because he increases the penalties for the law he then violates, and then says that by nature of being a president, he can violate the law that he just increased the penalty for. It's very silly.
So yeah, I remember when the Stormy Daniels indictment came out. I mean, obviously it wasn't good, but I remember thinking that, Wow, is this it? Is this the result of the long investigation that they did for Trump? I mean, I'm not saying he shouldn't be convicted, especially since there was like some campaign funding shenanigans going on with the Stormy Daniels thing. If I remember correctly, that it wasn't the hush money itself that was illegal, but there was something related to it that he got indicted for. But this classified document thing seems really bad. It
is very bad.
So
it should be political. It should be a political killer. But the problem is that he doesn't want to let go of the Republican Party's nomination. And this story has become that he is being, this is the Republican narrative, or at least what a lot of Republicans believe, not all Republicans, but a lot of them, that he is being persecuted by a conspiratorial and anti-Trump, anti-Republican deep state Justice Department who is going after him because he hates them, and he wants to challenge the deep state, and the deep state is going after him, and that this is most clearly shown through the hypocrisy of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden getting away with their dastardly crimes. That seems to be the main counter narrative, but I don't think that's going to stand up if he's found guilty of anything. If he's found guilty and Joe Biden isn't guilty, it's just going to be a hard thing to pitch to independents because that's provable. You can point to that.
And isn't that being investigated too now as well?
Yeah, no. Hunter Biden has just pled guilty to tax crimes. He's paying back the taxes, and yeah, I mean he accepted a plea deal, so he pled guilty.
Right. Okay. So I guess the obvious question is, which is such a weird question, if he's convicted, Trump, what can he be president?
Can he be president? Technically, it seems to be he could run for president. So I think so. I think as of right now, the theory is that he can. Eugene Debs ran for president out of prison. He's as far as I know, he's allowed to run for president from a prison cell. Yes. The odds of him winning, I think, would be greatly diminished. And I think the Republican Party would be very silly to do that. But yes, he technically can.
Okay, so then that is the next question then. What do you think is going to happen? Who is going to win the Republican nomination at this point?
Like, I think it's going to be Donald Trump.
You think so?
I think it's going to be, positive. I'm almost positive it's going to be Donald Trump because they've gotten so caught up in his own narrative of prosecution that it's made Republicans angry enough that they want to vote for him because the evil DOJ is going after him. And so while other people may have considered Ron DeSantis and other options more before, now they feel more devoted to Trump than ever because now this is the issue again. Now it's politically, now it's a politically hot topic again. Not to mention, I don't know if Ron DeSantis can deal with Donald Trump in a Republican primary debate or a heated Republican primary. Donald Trump's already insinuated that Ron DeSantis did some pedophile stuff with his former students. And if he's going to go that hard on Ron DeSantis, it's going to be brutal. We remember what Donald Trump said about Ted Cruz's wife, man. It's going to be a brutal, brutal primary. Yeah. Not to mention, it's a divided GOP primary now. It's not just Ron DeSantis. It's Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Chris Christie. There's not one unified Trump opposition. And one of the things that led to Trump winning the Republican primary, now maybe he would have won if this wasn't the case as well, but it was the fact that it wasn't until the end, until there was one unified candidate that everybody could get behind. And now that there's going to be 6 people against Donald Trump just has the biggest base, and he has a divided opposition. I think he has a clear shot for it.
Yeah, this is such a weird thing to look at from Finland, where, I mean, this started, I guess this sort of major shift started already in 2016 in the US, but like COVID, exacerbated it a lot. It did a lot to a lot of countries politically. But in Finland, I think, according to a lot of the polls, it increased trust in public institutions, the pandemic. Obviously, our measures were different.
Yeah, no, that did not happen here.
No.
That did not happen here. No.
We do have a growing anti-establishment political sphere that is further away than ever before. But it has shrunk, which is really interesting to see that the direction is opposite even in the U.S. at this point, and in many Western countries. But how does it happen?
That concerns me. Sorry, I just wanted to quickly say that's probably one of the things that I find most personally concerning about my country is the lack of public trust in institutions. Because if we face any crisis, whether it be another public health crisis, let's say that's something worse than COVID next time, or we face a national security crisis, either from domestically or from overseas or anywhere, if there's not public trust in institutions, it's going to be harder to get people to abide by government advice for a health crisis. It might be harder to manage disaster response. It might be harder to have free and fair elections that people trust in. If people don't trust in, maybe they won't engage in it, and then our democratic institutions get weaker and weaker. And if people don't trust our elections, then if they don't trust our government on the most basic level, then it's going to lead to more things like January 6th again and again. And I don't think that the stuff that led to January 6th is gone. I think a lot of the same symptoms and problems that we have are still there. And that type of violence, I think, could happen again. And that's why I believe, and maybe I'm just too much of a liberal, but we need to have stronger trust in our institutions. But I think a lot of this also responsibility falls on our institutions to build that trust. You can't just like call it to the public and be like, trust the institutions. They're institutions. Absolutely. Aren't they important? It's not going to work. You need to build trust with with the people. But that's a very, very tall task with how politically divided we are as a country right now.
Yeah. Do you think that sentiment has enough clout in the next election, maybe in the form of a Trump, to actually win the whole thing?
The polling data that I see right now shows that Trump definitely has a chance to win.
Yeah.
Donald, like it used to be that Ron DeSantis had better betting odds against Joe Biden. Now the polling data seems to have somewhat kind of balanced out a little bit more, and they seem to be somewhat tied. And maybe even Trump is edging Ron DeSantis in a lot of these recent polls and being better against Joe Biden. But it will all depend on how I think the legal case proceeds, how this last year of the Biden presidency proceeds. Because if we enter a recession, which is a possibility, if we entered a recession, that is something that can most certainly help the Republicans, because there is an existing narrative that the Republicans know how to manage the economy, even though it was the Bush government that led to the 2008 recession, and as Trump handed over the economy to Biden, and we were also entering a recession. But putting all that aside, the Republicans dominate messaging-wise on the economy, and so that is something that could definitely help Donald Trump. And if Joe Biden's the one in office when a recession happens, well then that's an argument against his time in power. So right now, it's really too far out to say who's going to win, obviously, and I don't have a magic 8-ball, but nobody should count Trump out, even with these legal problems. Because if he can stay out of a cell, or at least avoid the legal trouble long enough, and then there's an economic crisis or some other crisis the Biden administration faces, Trump survives the primary, he could be in the White House again. He could. I think I still think that he's not the strongest candidate that the Republicans could be running with, almost certainly, because of how much political baggage he has and the fact that he has ongoing legal trouble, but he still has a shot. And that's all Trump had the first time when he ran, and no one thought he would win then.
Yeah. And what, I mean, how would that affect U.S. support for Ukraine? How would that change geopolitics?
It would be very bad. It'd be very bad. On one hand, there would still be European nations that support Ukraine. There would still be congressionally approved aid that could be sent to Ukraine. The coalition for Ukraine is larger than just Joe Biden. Congress, if they congressionally approve aid and it's veto proof, he has to send it through. This is actually where the first, where one of the impeachments came from for Donald Trump, was because he was trying to dangle aid to Ukraine, which was already congressionally approved, over Zelensky's head in exchange for political favors, most obviously in political dirt on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son in Ukraine. So this is something that he eventually had to let go through anyway, but he tried to block in the past. I have no reason to believe that he has ethically changed in any way and wouldn't attempt to block it in the future if he wanted to. But then we could attempt to hold him accountable again, but I have a weird feeling that Republicans would just block another impeachment if he tried to do it again. But hypothetically, Congress can still pump through aid. The rest of our allies can still pump through aid, but without the presidential drawdown authority, that is going to kneecap the United States' ability to send aid to Ukraine. The American president has broad authority over American foreign policy, and not having one that would be sympathetic to aid to Ukraine and sympathetic to supporting Ukraine would be a massive loss. And he says constantly on the campaign trail that he's going to end the war on the first day. Now, this is a tall promise, one he can't deliver on, period, end of paragraph. And so realizing that, what happens when maybe he tries to do that and he fails? Does he say, okay, well, I'm still going to send aid? Or is he one of the people who's going to, flip the table, have all the checker pieces go everywhere and say, no, I'm not going to give any aid to Ukraine? I say that it's very easy for me to see him flipping the table and say, no aid to Ukraine. Definitely after we saw how he handled the withdrawal from Syria.
I'm old enough to remember the right-wing neocon era of American interventionism with Bush and with McCain and Cheney. Not McCain, but Cheney. How has this anti-interventionist politics shifted so radically from the left to the right in the U.S. and how quickly did it happen?
It depends on the geopolitical conflict, because if you were to ask, and Donald Trump is very strange because he's not consistent on it. During the start of his time in office, when he was dealing with Afghanistan, he increased drone strikes. He increased troop deployments. He restricted data on the drone strikes. He dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs, which is the largest non-nuclear explosive we have, on Afghanistan. He assassinated Soleimani, a high-ranking Iranian official in Iraq. He carried out and finished Operation Inherent Resolve, which is what he inherited from the Obama administration when fighting ISIS. He has increased drone strikes not only across Afghanistan, but across the entirety of the Middle East. Many people try to portray Trump as the peacemaker president, but he's also, we're getting reports of him during his time in the office, proposing an invasion of Venezuela, casually to his staff. He publicly is proposing bombing Iranian cultural sites, which is a war crime. On the campaign trail, he's openly calling for like the killing of civilians. So Trump, on one hand, will always say, like, look at me, I want to end all these endless wars. But on the other hand, when he was actually in office, he's putting people like John Bolton in a position of authority, which is one of the strongest war hawks you could possibly have on Capitol Hill, while also engaging in a foreign policy like I just described. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't do anything that was semi-isolationist. He did start the process of negotiations with the Taliban, which eventually led to our withdrawal. He has done I don't know if we would call the Abraham Accords isolationist, but he has done some things that are isolationist. His immigration policy certainly is isolationist. So I wouldn't even describe Trump necessarily inherently as an isolationist, but the movement around Trump is, not the political, necessarily politicians around Trump, but the movement around Trump is isolationist. When you look at a lot of the new Republicans like Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, kind of, wall up the world, we can deal with ours and our own type people. But the majority of elected Republicans still support aid to Ukraine. The majority of elected Democrats still support aid to Ukraine. And that's something I want to note. Even if the Republican base of the party is becoming more and more isolationist and kind of wall off the world than usual, I think the majority of Republicans now, or at least the plurality of Republicans, no longer support aid to Ukraine.
Okay, I'm going to have to let you go soon. Give you a bit of a breather before your Polish TV appearance.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to go over there, tell them how much I love Poland. It's fantastic. Smooze the Polish community.
Yeah, they're going to be very happy to have you there. This is a huge topic, but I just want to ask you maybe one or two questions about this, because we talked about it in the start of this episode. Your debates.
Yes.
Yeah, so what do you do debate all kinds of people from different walks of life and different ideologies, even like radical ideologies. So what do you see as the biggest, maybe it might be helpful if you give some examples of the kind of people you've debated, but what do you see as the biggest value in debating and discussing with even like sort of dangerously radical people? Maybe I should put the word dangerously there, but radical people.
I have a few reasons as to why I debate. Now, one reason, and this is very base, reason is because I sometimes find it very fun and I find it intellectually stimulating. The same reason why a lot of kids at debate club did debate, because it's good to test yourself and to make sure that your own ideas can stand up to scrutiny and that you're not just kind of like holed off in a room with a bunch of people that agree with you, never listening to an alternative opinion. And so I do think there's something that's personally rewarding for myself when it comes to engaging in debate. But the two main reasons I engage in debate outside of that is, number one, I think it's important for a democracy. That if we're going to say that we're a democratic society, you ultimately have to engage with other ideas that you disagree with. You need to engage in the processes of democracy, and that includes public dialogue, discussion of issues, and confronting the ideas that you don't like but other people hold, so you can get to the best policy proposals for your society, and you can have a societal, or try to build some societal consensus about the issues in the world around you. If you're going to live in a democracy, that is vital. Now, in times as divided as we are right now, it might feel difficult sometimes to listen to these alternative ideas or to try to build up tools in order to like deal with these ideas or try to confront these ideas when you see them. But I think it's important. I think it's very important for a democracy to just do it as a matter of practice. And the second thing that I care a lot about when it comes to doing this is I want to make sure that I give people the tools, as I was just talking about, to deal with propaganda, to deal with terrible ideas, and to deal with lies and disinformation, which a lot of people engage. A lot of the times when I talk to somebody who I know has nothing good to say, sometimes I've debated people who describe themselves as MAGA communists. So they're Donald Trump style Republican types who are also authoritarian communists, usually Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist types. They're very politically wacky. It's very politically niche. There's nobody at the ballot box writing in the Trump Stalin ticket. That's not a thing, right? So I don't need to worry about it at the ballot box. But some of the times when people are in these niche communities, they're going to say conspiracy stuff you see pop up online all the time. The CIA overthrew the Ukrainian government. And then I have him say that in a debate with me, and I can go through the evidence against that. Like, number one, the CIA did not allocate any funds to the Ukrainian government. They didn't allocate any funds to overthrow the Ukrainian government. There's no paper trail for this. There's no money for this. There is a domestic reasons for this happening. You can talk about popular discontent. You talk about the murdering of protesters. You can talk about how American officials actually wanted the protesters to accept the deal, but the protesters did what the American government didn't want them to do, which is actually keep going and not accept the deal that Klitschko had negotiated with the Yanukovych regime. And once I've pushed back against that, when somebody engaged with that idea in the future, maybe they can think twice before just like falling into a propaganda rabbit hole. And that's another purpose for these conversations, because if you don't engage with these ideas, when eventually somebody in your community sees these ideas, or somebody that could have been exposed to these ideas in a confrontational environment, or an environment where it could have been confronted, an environment where it was brought up to question, like, wait a second, let's question this idea, a critical environment. Later, they'll see it in an echo chamber and they won't have the tools to deal with it. And they'll be like, well, I mean, nobody pushed back against it. I mean, he said it, and I can't find anything online pushing back against it. So it is what it is.
Right. Yeah. For anyone who even might be a potential fence sitter, it might be a sign of weakness in the long run to see people sort of collectively escape confrontation with difficult ideas, and it might even a sign of weakness. Like, why don't you want to engage with this point? I've heard,
absolutely. Yeah. And you hear that all the time about different political movements, but you hear everybody say it about their opposing political movement. They don't like to debate. They don't want to be confronted. But if you don't confront these ideas and you don't deal with these ideas, it is going to make you look weak. It is going to make it look like your ideas are too weak for scrutiny.
Sometimes the argument that is heard is that you don't want to validate these ideas by sort of giving them an equal platform. What do you answer? What's your reply to that?
I think there can be a discussion about what environment is appropriate for these ideas. But I run an internet podcast, right? There is no idea too dastardly that isn't appropriate for an internet podcast, right? We're not at the Grammys, we're not at the Emmys, okay? We're at the dark, disgusting corners of the internet, right? So I don't know how much I would apply this to that standard, but I will also say that if the ideas are popular, or the ideas have people who believe in them, that at some point you have to talk about it. You can't ignore it. And part of having a conversation about these ideas is going to have to be talking to the people who believe them them about why they believe them. Because if you don't talk to them about why they believe them, or don't listen to the narratives that they've heard in order to believe the ideas that they believe, then you're never going to be able to drag those people out of those rabbit holes. And there's not going to be any material to stop people falling into those rabbit holes. So even if the idea is deplorable, you have to be able to engage with it. Because if you can't engage with it, then you're going to be weak to it. And ultimately, that's going to help the idea more in the long run.
Yeah,
the bad idea.
I do agree with that. Finnish political sort of conversational culture is very polite compared to, let's say, the U.S. And I think maybe that's a symptom of having a stable society that has high trust in institutions, and it's sort of held together in the.
I don't like that. And like, well, we're stable, unlike you guys. That's not a good sign to hear that from somebody abroad.
A bit more stable, I'd say. But I mean, I'm rooting for you guys. I'm just I don't know how to describe it. I mean, we do have a kind of a compromise friendly conversational culture where people from the sort of different sides of the mainstream can easily talk together. It might get heated, but it's sort of seen as a good thing, seen as a value in society. But then I think there isn't as big of a sort of subculture of having discussions with sort of open, honest discussions with some of the more fringe ideas, some of the more scary ideas, and I think this might come from, and we've only been a sort of practicing liberal democracy for a few decades, sort of honestly speaking. I mean, we were formally a democracy, independent democracy during the Cold War, but it was the foreign policy from the Soviet Union at that time really, really restricted or like chilled down conversation, political discussion here in Finland. And I think that sort of Finlandization is maybe a term that you've heard, and that really affected political culture here in Finland. And that sort of the aftermath of that might still be seen here, and we don't have debate classes in school. I mean, I think there are debate clubs, but they're not mainstream. They're not like practiced in the mainstream, which is a shame. And right now, what we're seeing here in Finland is a lot of these sort of more fringe ideas, more conspiratorial ideas, or more sort of heinous ideas are sort of slowly popping into the mainstream. Like, we have people in the parliament talking about our version of the Great Replacement right now here in Finland, because we had some refugees come here in 2015, and now everyone is, not everyone, but a minority of people are panicking about that. And yeah, I'm afraid about the same things as you are. Like, if we don't have the tools to actually sort of engage with these arguments, instead of just infinitely calling these heinous ideas or dangerous ideas or whatever, then we're not going to have the tools to sort of combat them in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you might need to be in a position where you're Putin's government dealing with the brutal truth of what Prigozhin's saying as they're marching towards your Moscow. Then what are you going to do as those narratives start to take over and start to grab hold of the population because you can't push back against them? Is Putin going to debate club right now? I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much, Dylan, for joining Futucast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, maybe we can do this sometime again, but this was more than enough for now. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. Do you want to promo your pages? Where can people find you?
Sure. You can find me at cia.gov, dylanburns.tv, which is my website. You can also find me at Dylan Burns Live and Dylan Burns TV on YouTube. Dylan Burns 1776 on Twitter and Dylan Burns TV on Instagram.
All right. Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation. As I said, we do have some other English episodes. And Neil Woods, for example, and then we had Brittany Kaiser actually on a bit over a year ago. That was also quite interesting. And we'll surely do more of these in the future. Not as often as we do our Finnish language episodes, obviously, because we're a Finnish language podcast, but there will be more if you want them there to be. All right. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Please comment, subscribe, like, all the rest. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Futucast, and such like. Thanks. See you next week. Bye-bye.